The baby cried through the blizzard, and Eli Bennett had nothing left to give. No milk, no wife, no warmth. Then came the knock. A young woman, soaked to the skin, held out her arms. Her own child had died last week, but her milk remained. That night, they saved the baby together. By morning, the rumors began. Not married. Not legal. And by sundown, a slick banker showed a debt note. A scarred deputy flashed a fake badge. Eli didn't raise his rifle. He opened his ledger. They wanted to freeze him out. But what if mercy, not bullets, could turn a town? What would you do if a storm brought you a child, a stranger, and a war for your home? The wind came in low and bitter that morning, like it meant to pry open every knot in the ridge. Eli Bennett tightened the barn latch with red knuckles and ducked inside. The goat stared at him, unimpressed. 2 bottles of milk stood on the shelf, warmed just enough. He tucked them into his coat and trudged back through the white. Inside, Ruth Ann sat cross-legged on the woven rug, cradling baby June. Her hair was still damp from washing, sleeves rolled to her elbows, eyes half shut with fatigue. The baby fussed, but latched. Peace held, for now. Eli knelt beside them and set down the bottles. "You eat yet?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not since the middle of the night. I made porridge." She looked up, managing a soft smile. "I don't even like porridge." "I know." He rose stiffly. "But the baby does." That got a real smile. They had carved out a rhythm in the weeks since the storm. No vows spoken, no claims laid, just milk, warm fires, and the slow stitching of quiet trust. He built her a cradle from pine. She fixed the loose shutter with wire and scrap. They didn't say what they were building, only that it felt better than what had been. But rumors move faster than wagons. By noon, horse hooves crunched up the drive. Eli opened the door and stepped out, coat still unbuttoned. 2 riders waited at the gate, one clean-shaven and smug, the other with a scar running down his jaw like a fork of lightning. The clean one was Vern Lockwood, banker from Dusty Creek. The scarred man wore a tarnished tin star and a stare like gravel. "Mr. Bennett," Lockwood called out, "we come peaceable. Don't make us holler in front of the lady." Eli walked out far enough to see their faces clear. "Then talk low." Lockwood pulled out a folded paper and held it up. "Your homestead's tied to an unpaid debt, signed by your late father-in-law. We bought the note last year. It matured 2 weeks ago." Eli didn't blink. "He died 10 years ago." Lockwood shrugged. "The note didn't." Eli glanced at the star. "And the badge?" "Deputy Rake Dent," the scarred man replied. "Appointed by Acting Sheriff Tillman during Cutter's illness. Convenient timing." "Convenient or not," Lockwood said, unfolding the paper, "this land now falls under forfeiture proceedings unless you vacate or pay in full." Eli looked back at the cabin. June's cry pierced the air for a second. High, hungry, real. Rake's eye twitched. "Give us the woman and the child," Rake said flatly. "You'll keep the barn." For now, Eli stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. "You're not crossing that threshold," he said. Rake nudged his horse forward. Eli's hand rested on his coat. Not on the rifle inside, just the cloth. "If you touch her without writ or warrant, you'll be explaining it to a real judge." Lockwood raised a palm. "Let's not be hasty, boys." "We'll bring papers, real ones. Do that." They turned back down the hill. Rake spit in the snow, but didn't argue. Eli watched until they vanished past the ridge. Inside, Ruth Ann stood at the door, pale but steady. "They'll come back," she said. "Yep, they'll bring more than paper." "Likely." She held the baby tighter. Eli nodded once and looked out at the trail where the riders had gone. "Then we make ready." That evening, Ruth Ann finds a scrap of paper nailed to the gatepost. "Eviction notice. Final warning. The ink smears in the snow. Trouble, it seems, rides on a timetable now." By morning, the porch rail bore a new message, tacked with a crooked nail and written in a banker's fine script. "Eviction notice. Final warning. Vacate by first thaw." The snow had soaked the bottom edge, blurring the signature. Ruth Ann read it twice and turned away, pressing baby June closer to her chest. Eli didn't curse, didn't raise his voice. He pulled the paper loose, folded it once, and tucked it behind the stove ledger, where he kept seed lists and wood tallies. "They think loud makes it legal," he murmured. That afternoon, he rode to Dusty Creek alone, coat buttoned to the chin. Ruth Ann stayed behind with June, though her shoulders were stiff with dread. Eli's first stop was the schoolhouse. Miss Lorna Shea, 30 and sharp as a saw, met him at the door with chalk still on her fingers. "Mr. Bennett," she said, brushing her hands. "Troubles in the wind?" "Been in it for a while," he replied. "You ever notice anything strange about Deputy Dent's badge?" She narrowed her eyes. "Shiny as a polished spoon, and I'd wager it's about as deep. He swapped it out 2 weeks ago. Told me the old one got bent on a drunk. You see where he got the new one? From a man named Hollis. Tinker's cart out near the river bend. He sells buttons and trinkets. Not much else," Eli nodded. "Thank you kindly." Miss Shea's gaze softened. "Is it true about the baby? About Ruth Ann?" "She's not mine by blood," Eli said quietly. "But they're mine just the same." She reached for her coat. "You're not the only one tired of Lockwood playing law. Come Sunday, I'll stand where needed." Next was the forge. Josiah Sutter was blackened with soot, arms thick from years at the anvil. "That cradle rail you brought in," Josiah grunted, "split clean through." "Riders did it," Eli said. "Same men who ran off the calf string. Dent and Lockwood's boys. Didn't see brands, just boots," Josiah huffed. "Lockwood owes me iron for 6 months. Pays late, talks fast. Got a ledger?" Eli reached into his saddlebag and handed over a rough book with notches beside names, dates, and notes on creek levels. Josiah flipped through. "You're tracking flow?" "They dammed it somewhere up the ridge. My trough's near dry," Josiah pointed with his thumb. "Talk to old Preacher Wills. He's been hammering survey stakes since Grant was president." Eli mounted up again. The preacher was near blind now, but sharp of mind, living in a lean-to behind the dry chapel. "I remember that land," Wills said, tapping his cane. "Your father-in-law homesteaded it in '56. Lot line ran 20 paces east of where Lockwood's claim starts. He says the debt fell on me." "He lies," Wills said flatly. "A man's debt don't carry past the grave without writ or cosign." Eli helped the old man sit back. "You have proof?" "Behind the pulpit. Old surveyor's map. Watercourse marked with red chalk." "Bring your compass." Eli rode back through falling snow. The sky was gray and low, like it wanted to press the ridge flat. Inside, Ruth Ann stirred stew in the pot. June dozed near the fire, belly full, cheeks pink from warmth. "Did they believe you?" she asked. "Don't need belief," Eli said. "Just truth and time." She turned to him then, really turned, and held his eyes. "They'll come back. I know. And if they take you?" "They won't take you," he said. Outside, the wind scraped against the eaves like claws, but inside, the light held. Eli pulls down his late wife's trunk that night, looking for old receipts, and finds something buried deeper than paper, a map, a seal, and a question no banker wants asked. That night, while the wind pushed against the window panes like some lonesome animal, Eli brought down the cedar trunk that once held his late wife's quilts. He set it gently on the table and opened it with care, brushing aside folded linens and a keepsake doll to reveal a false-bottomed panel. He'd never noticed the small notch along the edge before. He pressed it, and the wood clicked free. Inside lay 2 items wrapped in oilcloth, a folded parcel map and a yellowed envelope sealed with wax. Ruth Ann came quietly from the hearth, where June now slept in the cradle Josiah had repaired. "What is it?" she whispered. Eli broke the seal. The paper inside crackled as he unfolded it. "A debt receipt," he said, reading it slow. "Paid in full, signed and dated. Banker's stamp clear as spring water." "Then Lockwood's lien is dust," Eli said, "unless he's banking on no one ever checking." He spread the map next. It was rough, hand-drawn, but marked with the kind of notations only surveyors used: degrees, chains, and a red X by the creek bend. "Look here," he said, tracing a line. "Our cabin sits here, but Lockwood's claim ends 20 paces east of the ridge. He's pinned that lien to the wrong parcel." Ruth Ann leaned in. "Then why risk it? Maybe he thinks folks don't ask questions. Or maybe," Eli added, folding the map, "he's desperate." The next morning he rode to town again, this time carrying both the map and receipt tucked in a hard leather folio. He found Miss Shea just finishing lessons. "The county clerk," Eli asked, "he still play cards with Lockwood?" "Every Wednesday," she replied without hesitation. "You think he could have been persuaded?" Miss Shea nodded once. "I'll testify." Next, he visited Preacher Wills. The old man nodded sagely after examining the documents. That's your land. No mistake. You force a survey with the judge watching, he'll have to rule fair. Eli exhaled slow. Then came Josiah, who read over the papers and said, You'll need 2 more voices to press this public. I'll be one. The others. Ruth. Eli hesitated. I won't put her in the middle of this. She's already in it, Josiah said, and standing straight. That night, by firelight, Eli laid the map on the table for Ruth Ann. I want you to see it first, he said. This proves it's our land. Her hands shook just slightly as she touched the corner of the paper. I never had land before. It's more than dirt, Eli replied. It's peace, and you helped hold it. She looked up at him then. If you ask me to speak, I will. For June, for us, he nodded. Sunday, the judge rides through for the spring circuit. I'll file to contest the lien and request a field review. She folded the map with him, the corners meeting clean. You think Lockwood knows? I think he suspects, Eli said, and men like him get mean when they're losing quiet. Outside, the snow had stopped. The wind still muttered in the trees, but the sky was clear. Inside, the fire popped, and baby June made a soft cooing noise in her sleep. Eli looked around the room, plain, patched, but honest. And he thought, truth may be slow, but it don't freeze. The town meeting draws near. Lockwood sharpens his lies. Eli has paper and proof. But will that be enough when a fake badge flashes and the crowd starts to turn? Saturday came clear and cold, the kind of bright winter morning where breath hung silver and boots snapped ice on the porch. Snowmelt Ridge looked innocent under the blue sky, but Eli's gut felt tight. That afternoon's town meeting would decide more than land. It would test whether folks still believed in plain truth over polished lies. Ruth Ann dressed June slow and careful. The baby blinked wide-eyed at the morning light. You sure about coming? Eli asked from the door, tucking the sealed envelope and map into his coat. I won't be hidden again, Ruth Ann said gently. You'll speak from the law. I'll speak from what I saw. Eli nodded. All right. They rode double to Dusty Creek, arriving just as the bell above the courthouse struck 2. Townsfolk were already filling benches and leaning against walls, ranchers, storekeepers, school children with red cheeks. At the front of the room stood Judge Harland, tall and square-shouldered, with snow still clinging to his boots. Lockwood was there, too, coat freshly brushed, a stack of papers in his gloved hand, and a smirk stitched tight across his face. Deputy Rake Dent loomed beside him, tin star catching the sun through the windows. Eli stood tall but didn't rush. He stepped forward when the floor opened. Judge Harland, he said, tipping his hat, I'm here to request a lawful field survey of my parcel. Section 3B, ridgeline to creek. I've cause to believe the lien filed on it attaches to the wrong land. The judge raised a brow. You've proof? Eli pulled out the sealed receipt and the original map. Debt's been paid. Map confirms the boundary, and folks here have seen the water diversion. Gasps rippled through the benches. Lockwood stepped up, voice smooth as creek ice. Your Honor, this man squats on gray land with no clear title. We all know papers can be forged. From the back, Miss Shea stood. That receipt's real. I saw him carry it from his wife's things, and I heard your deputy say the parcel would be his by spring if we stayed. Quiet Rake Dent stepped forward, hand brushing his holster. You calling me crooked, schoolmarm? Tin don't make the man, Josiah rumbled, standing beside her. And your badge sounds wrong. I tapped it once. Hollow. The room stilled. Then Ruth Ann stepped forward, June bundled in her arms. I saw men move rocks by lantern after the storm. My baby didn't sleep through it. The creek dropped by morning. The judge folded his arms. Do you swear to that, ma'am? I do, she said, voice steady. Lockwood sneered. This is theater. The man wants sympathy, not justice. Eli didn't flinch. I want the law, and I'll accept its word, whichever way it falls. Judge Harlan looked around the room, then back to Lockwood. Very well. I grant a public review. Tomorrow at noon, we walk the land. Bring your surveyor. I'll bring mine. Lockwood's smile cracked just slightly. That soon? The judge nodded. You made the claim. We settle it now. The gavel fell. Outside, wind had picked up again. Eli held Ruth Ann's hand as they walked back to the horses. The blacksmith caught his eye and gave a slow nod. Behind them, Rake Dent slammed a boot against the post rail, and the tin badge on his chest gave a dull, tinny ring. Tomorrow, the town will walk Snowmelt Ridge. But Lockwood doesn't wait. His riders strike first, aiming to break more than fences. Will Eli stand firm when the cradle falls? The ridge was bone white by sunrise. Wind whispered through the pines, but for the first time in days, the sky held no threat. Eli stood on the porch with a hammer in hand, nailing a notice to the gatepost. It was written neat and plain. Parcel correction filed. Field review Sunday noon. Behind him, the cabin stirred. Ruth Ann rocked June by the fire, whispering a lullaby made from breath and memory. The night before, Eli had crept out to the creek and loosened a log jam with a pole and prayer. Now, a trickle flowed back to the trough, not much, but enough for the livestock to drink and hope to stir. "You think it'll hold?" Ruth Ann asked when he came back in. Eli knelt by the stove and fed the fire. "If it don't, I'll find another way." That morning, he rode to Dusty Creek and pinned his petition to the courthouse board. Parcel 3B, corrected boundary, survey requested, debt dismissed by sealed receipt. It was bold, and it was legal, but bold don't always mean safe. By dusk, the retaliation came. 3 riders in Lockwood's pay thundered across the ridge, scattering Eli's cattle like dry leaves. One of them swung a lariat, snapping it near the goats to drive them off. Another dismounted and took a crowbar to the cradle Eli had built with his own hands. White pines shattered like dry bone. Inside, Ruth Ann pressed June close and kept the door barred. By the time Eli returned, the yard looked like a warning. Splintered rails, cattle gone, cradle smashed. He didn't shout. He gathered the broken cradle pieces one by one and set them in a quiet pile under the eaves. Ruth Ann sat on the step, rocking June in her arms, lips tight. "They didn't touch us," she said, though her hands trembled. "Not directly." Eli touched her shoulder, then looked out over the fence line. "They will. If the creek doesn't scare 'em off, the truth might." That night, Eli worked under the moonlight. With frost on his collar and a rasp in his glove, he carved a new cradle rail from driftwood, not because June needed it just yet, but because the act itself meant something. At dawn, he planted a small pine sapling by the gate. It had survived under the snow near the creek, roots still strong. He tamped the dirt around it firm and said, "Lo, you're not just for shade, you're for staying." The gesture wasn't missed. Before noon, a rider passed slow along the ridge trail. Ruth Ann saw him from the window. It was Lockwood himself, coat buttoned high, hands gloved, watching the tree like it was a line drawn in blood. He didn't dismount. He just tipped his hat, turned his mount, and rode off. By supper, Josiah rode up from town. He'd heard about the raid. "You all right?" the blacksmith asked, dismounting. "We're standing," Eli said simply. Josiah leaned on the porch rail. "Word is, Lockwood's fuming. He thinks you've shamed him, says he'll snap that sapling by noon." Eli smiled faintly, eyes on the tree. "Then he'll have to touch root to do it." Ruth Ann stepped onto the porch, June bundled against her chest. "He underestimates what it takes to grow anything in winter," she said. Josiah nodded. "Town's shifting, Eli. Some folks are watching now, not just whispering. Keep steady." Tomorrow, truth walks. As Sunday approaches, Lockwood sends one last message, with irons and shame. Can Eli endure humiliation for what's right, or will the town let fear win again? The frost had teeth that morning. Ruth Ann stood in the doorway, June bundled tight, watching Eli roll up his sleeves. He'd just saddled the mule to check the line fence when hoofbeats cracked the quiet. 3 riders approached, fast, sharp, too deliberate. Rake Dent swung down first. His tin star caught the pale light. "Eli Bennett," he said flat, "you're under arrest for obstruction and tampering with water rights." Eli stepped off the porch slow, hands at his sides. "On whose say?" Dent held up a folded order with Lockwood's name scrawled at the bottom. Ruth Ann stepped forward. "That ain't real." He filed that after the county notice went up. Dent's lip twitched. "Don't matter. I've got authority, no," Eli said evenly. "You've got a badge that rattles." Rake struck him. The back of his glove caught Eli's cheek and dropped him to one knee. Ruth Ann gasped. June began to wail. Eli stood without touching the bruise, his voice steady. "I'll go peaceful. Just don't bring your boots near my family." Dent clamped irons on him anyway. They paraded Eli through Dusty Creek like a prize steer. Folks turned their heads or watched from windows. A few muttered, "He didn't fight," or "That baby's fed, ain't she?" But most stayed quiet. The jail was cold and half dark. Josiah Yates stood outside the next cell with arms folded, face grim. "They pulled you in too?" Eli asked. Josiah shook his head. "Volunteered. Figured somebody should witness it proper." "Appreciate that." The hours dragged. Ruth Ann came once, set a bundle of bread and jerky just past the bars. She said nothing, but her eyes spoke loud. Dent had tried to shame them, but she wasn't breaking. As the fire died down and the wind picked up, Josiah leaned over the rail between cells. "You know," he said low, "I heard something back in the saloon." Riders bragged loud. One of them said Lockwood was real fond of that weak tin badge, and how it makes noise when folks look nervous. They ain't even hiding the bluff. Eli smiled faintly. "Then let 'em talk louder. Tomorrow, we don't shout." We show Josiah nodded. "Ruth Ann okay?" "She's more than okay. She's anchored." That night, Eli lay on the cot and stared at the plank ceiling. He pictured the bearings from the map, 20 paces south, 6 east. The memory held. So did he. At dawn, the deputy unlocked the cell. "You'll walk quiet," Rake said. "No tricks." "Judge's order." Eli nodded and stepped into the light. The cuffs were loose now, cold against skin. The wind had dropped. Snow sparkled on the ridge like promise. As they passed the general store, the schoolmarm stepped out, chin high. She didn't flinch when she saw the irons. Near the livery, Ruth Ann waited with June swaddled and calm. "Water still runs," she said. "The trough's full." Eli's voice cracked just once. "Good." Then from behind the church the bell began to ring. Townsfolk followed its call, drawn by habit or hope. Sunday had come. Rake Dent grunted, "Let's get this over with." Eli looked at the crowd gathering. The judge had arrived with saddle dust on his coat. Lockwood stood nearby, smug, one hand on his walking stick. But the blacksmith, the prospector, and even the parson stood beside the old fence post where the field review would begin. They weren't shouting. They were watching. Eli walks to the creek in chains, but every step counts. With eyes on him and truth in hand, can one man shift the tide of a whole town? The sun broke cold and flat across the snow as the town gathered by the creek. Eli stood tall despite the irons, coat open to the wind, face unshaven, eyes calm. Sheriff Barker kept close but didn't touch him. Judge Randall sat on a folding chair under a wool blanket, rubbing his hands and frowning at Lockwood's pile of paper. Lockwood grinned, sharp and toothy. "Your man's in chains, Judge." "Seems we've settled this." "No," Eli said clearly. "We haven't." A murmur passed through the crowd. Ruth Ann stood near the blacksmith, June bundled on her hip. Josiah Yates nodded once. The prospector Whitlow stepped forward with a compass dangling from his belt. "Judge," Eli said, "I'd like to request 3 paces and a marker. Let the town see the truth for." Themselves Randall glanced at the sheriff. Barker shrugged. "He's earned that much." The judge nodded. "You may proceed." Josiah unlocked the cuffs. Eli rubbed his wrists, then took the compass and faced the frozen bank. He turned slow, shoulders square. "From the fence post, 20 south, 6 east," he said. Whitlow paced beside him, counting with a surveyor's rhythm. 3, 4, 5. The 6th step ended in a clump of reeds glazed with ice. Eli knelt, pushed snow aside, and scraped the ground with his gloved hand. Wood struck stone. He pulled out a buried stake. The prospector grunted. "Boundary marker, all right. Been here longer than the new fence," gasps whispered from the crowd. Lockwood stepped forward, voice smug. "Even if that were true, the lien stands. He owes debt on this parcel." "Not this one," the schoolmarm called out, lifting a folded paper high. "This is the receipt from the original loan, paid off by his wife before she passed. Found in her effects, postmarked and stamped. That lien's worthless." Lockwood's mouth twisted. "Forgery." Josiah stepped forward, a hammer in hand. He tapped Rake Dent's badge once. It spun and dropped into the snow with a hollow clink. The tin is bent under his boot. "Carnival junk," he said. "I know real rivets. That star's fake." The crowd turned. Rake Dent reached for his belt, then thought better of it. He backed away slowly, jaw clenched. Lockwood hissed, "This is nonsense. That spring isn't even—" Just then, one of his hired men stepped toward the bank with a pry bar. "Want me to prove it?" He wedged the bar into the rocks near the edge. "Don't," Eli said, but the man heaved. The bank collapsed with a groan. A chunk of earth fell, and behind it, a gush of water burst out, clear and steady. A spring, natural, flowing right from Eli's side of the creek. The judge stood up. "Well, I'll be." A full silence fell over the crowd. Even the wind paused. Then Ruth Ann spoke, soft and certain. Truth was always there, just took some work to find it. The judge turned to Lockwood. "Unless you've got better proof, sir, the lien is invalid, the map inaccurate, and the deputy disqualified." Lockwood opened his mouth, closed it again. His face drained to white. "Eli," the judge said, "you're free. Your homestead is lawfully yours." Eli nodded, slow, much obliged. He turned toward Ruth Ann and the baby. Their eyes met through the hush, and then someone clapped. Another joined. Soon the whole town was applauding, not loud or rowdy, but with something deeper in it. Respect. Lockwood isn't done scheming just yet, but Ruth Ann carries the final paper, and Dusty Creek might just find its backbone. The judge's ruling rang clear in the brittle air, but Lockwood didn't back down, not yet. "I've got one more claim," he barked, regaining some of his false confidence. "A land option filed 5 years ago on the Upper Ridge. It was never formally challenged. Makes the spring mine by flow rights." A few townsfolk murmured. That ridge was sacred ground to the old-timers. Dry most of the year, but it fed every trough come thaw. If Lockwood owned it, he could strangle the town. The judge frowned. "You've never presented that document in court." "No need," Lockwood said, pulling a wax-sealed envelope from inside his coat. "It's pre-filed. That ridge is mine. You'll see." Before he could break the seal, Ruth Ann stepped forward, June on her hip. "Judge Randall," she said softly, "if I may." The baby cooed, and for a moment all eyes shifted to her. Then Ruth Ann reached into her satchel and produced a second envelope, weathered, creased, and tied with ribbon. This came from the same trunk as the debt receipt. "We didn't think it mattered, until now." She handed it to the judge. He opened it slowly, adjusting his spectacles. His brow furrowed, then rose. "It's a homestead patent," he said, voice calm but ringing with finality. "Signed and recorded. Filed 6 months after Lockwood's option expired. Issued to a Sarah B. Bennett deed and survey enclosed." Lockwood's jaw slackened. "That's my late wife," Eli said, stepping forward. "We never posted it wide, thought we'd grow into it slow." "You grew into it just in time," the judge murmured. "The ridge is yours, Mr. Bennett. That spring's source, and every inch around it, stands protected under your name." The crowd shifted. Josiah let out a sharp whistle. The schoolmarm clapped once, then again. Others followed. Lockwood stood in the middle of it all, shrinking. His fine coat looked thinner now, his boots scuffed. He turned to Rake Dent, who stood cuffed beside the sheriff's wagon, lips pursed. "You going to say something?" Lockwood snapped. Rake just shook his head. "You promised gold and gave me tin." The judge raised a hand. "Enough." He pointed to the deputy. "Rake Dent, you're charged with impersonating a law officer, unlawful detention, and falsifying evidence. Sheriff, take him in." Cutter stepped forward, clapped the irons on tighter, and hauled the man toward the wagon. Lockwood tried to follow, but Josiah blocked his path. "You ain't under arrest," Josiah said, "but you ain't welcome neither." The banker straightened, trying for dignity. "I'll return to town. Withdraw my holdings." "No need," Ruth Ann said gently. "You already sold your buggy this morning. The clerk mentioned it. Wagons waiting." Indeed, a creaky old supply cart stood near the road. One mule, no driver. Lockwood looked around for allies, found none. He muttered something about starting fresh, then climbed aboard, avoiding everyone's eyes. As the cart rattled down the snowy path, a gust caught his papers and scattered them like lost feathers. Eli watched him go, then turned to the crowd. "I reckon truth don't ride fast, but it rides straight." The people nodded, and this time, it wasn't just politeness, it was something deeper. Recognition, respect. Josiah clapped Eli on the shoulder. "Let's get your fence mended." "And the cradle," the schoolmarm added. "We can fix it good as new." Ruth Ann smiled. "Maybe with a little extra room." Eli looked at her, then down at her belly, just beginning to round beneath her coat. He touched his hat, quiet and full of thanks. "Spring's coming fast, but can healing grow as surely as water flows? Let's find out." Spring came fast that year, like it had something to prove. Snow peeled back from the ridge in long curls. The trough filled on its own for the first time since Christmas. A robin nested under the eaves, and the sound of new boards being hammered echoed across Snowmelt Ridge. Eli stepped back from the fence rail, wiped sawdust from his sleeve, and watched Ruth Ann carry a bundle of clothes to the new line. June, pudgy and curious, toddled at her hem, giggling as she caught a corner of the drying quilt. The white pine sapling he'd planted still stood by the fence, taller now, its needles soft and green. Beneath it, a low stone marker read, S.B. Just Initials. Just enough. Folks came and went. More now. Josiah stopped by weekly, always with nails in his pockets and some story that needed telling. The schoolmarm brought books for June, and sometimes left with fresh bread. Even the judge had returned one morning, not with papers, but with coffee and a hand-carved rattle for the coming baby. Ruth Ann's belly was rounding gently beneath her apron. Her walk had changed, slower, sure, but her voice had grown clearer, stronger. She helped teach a group of girls at the church, mostly reading and numbers, but also how to raise your chin when someone calls you less than you are. One Sunday, Eli carved 3 names into the main beam over the hearth: Sarah, Ruth, June. He didn't say anything about it, just ran his fingers over the letters and nodded once. That afternoon, a few families gathered by the creek. The water ran cool and steady now, untouched by claim or threat. The prospector stood knee-deep in boots, showing young boys how to measure slope with a compass and a length of twine. "Line's no good if it don't hold straight," he said. "Same as men." The schoolmarm smiled and laid out a cloth for sandwiches. Josiah tuned a battered fiddle. Ruth Ann laughed when June stole a biscuit and held it up like a trophy. Lockwood had left town 2 weeks prior, sold his buggy, took the old cart and 1 mule. Folks said he headed east, though no one bothered to ask why. His name no longer carried weight. Just silence. Rake Dent sat in county holding, waiting on a trial. Sheriff Cutter had replaced the tin star with one of real metal. Not fancy, but true. That night, Eli stood at the ridge as the sun folded into gold. Ruth Ann joined him, her hands resting atop the rise of her belly. "You ever think it had come to this?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I hoped." They stood that way a long time, just watching. Below them, Snowmelt Ridge breathed easy, fields greening, water running. One house, one trough, one cradle mended. "You think folks'll remember how it happened?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "but, more important, they'll remember it can." She nodded. He turned to her, eyes soft. "This, what we've got, it's not owed. It's earned." Every day she touched his hand. "I know. If you believe quiet courage matters more than loud threats, if you believe family is built on care, not claims, if you believe water, love, and truth should run free, then friend, you belong on this trail with us." Subscribe for more frontier stories, and share this one with someone who knows what real strength looks like.